Hello. Today I am going to be talking about returning safely to sports after detraining occurs. And I wanted to talk about this today just because primarily it made me aware of this with all the COVID restrictions and how everyone's been home and hasn't been able to go to gyms. And we're getting ready to start back to sports if you haven't already. And there's quite a bit of injury risk associated with this, so I wanted to make sure that we talked about this today. Let me get to the next slide. So while a lot of our athletes were probably trying to stay fit while they were home, we offered a lot of virtual workouts and things like that. It is still not quite the same stimulus to the body or mind. And we know that while the athletes are practicing, training, competing, they are improving themselves with the stresses that are put on them in these instances. And these stresses are then how the athletes adapt. And when there is not these stresses of practices, competition, training, then their body also adapts to these lower levels. And because of all of this, then we can reasonably assume that these athletes' training adaptations have been deteriorating. And this is what we call detraining. So detraining is a partial or complete decrement in performance and loss of accumulated physiological adaptations following a reduction in the frequency, volume, and or intensity of training. Now, the losses can depend on many factors, such as their age, their fitness level when the cessation of activity begins, how long they had been involved in exercise prior to the break, what type of exercise was being performed, and also at what level. So typically your higher trained athletes, your elite athletes, they are probably going to see a little less drastic of a loss as quickly as maybe some of your less trained athletes. But these are just things to take into account because we have had a break for a significant period of time. Typically, we're just looking at maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month, but we've been out for quite some time. And so we can pretty much guarantee that there have been some losses. The physiological changes that occur during detraining, these are just a few. I could get into a whole lot of science and exercise physiology terms that would probably bore you guys to death. So we're just going to kind of quickly sum it up with there's obviously a loss of cardiovascular gains. So when we exercise, our heart's ability to pump more efficiently gets better. And so when we're not doing that, then obviously that's going to go down. With this decreased ability to pump the blood, we're also not moving the oxygen through our body as well. And then our muscles also can't process the oxygen as well. So you're going to see your athletes get tired a lot faster. And then some of the neuromuscular adaptations is they're going to have a decrease in muscle fiber size. And they're also going to have decreased flexibility and also just the way their bodies process foods, especially like our carbs that we use for fuel, is also going to be less efficient. So like I said a little bit earlier, no exercise for anywhere from 2 to 8 months can basically mean a loss of all their previous fitness gains, which is super frustrating, both as coaches and athletic trainers and for the athletes themselves, I'm sure, because they're like, oh, I just worked so hard for all of this and then now it's gone. So a really good quote I found from this Velocity Sports Performance page is they said that detraining is a bit like withdrawing money from a bank account. Think of training and practice time as money that's been invested. The longer the restrictions last, the more the athletes are withdrawing from their savings and their accounts are starting to dwindle. It is up to us in sports to make sure that we are returning these athletes to sport safely, successfully, and sustainably. And we need to understand that they are in a different condition And that is our first step. So in all these actions, I like this little chart here. It's showing that they're going to be different as far as strength. Most of them are probably going to have strength losses unless they have an amazing home gym at home and they were like working out every day. Their reactivity is definitely going to be impacted. So how they react, their muscles are reacting to movement is going to be decreased. This is highly going to impact risk of injury as well. Their body awareness, their mental focus, and we're probably going to see a lot of this as well as they've been doing online schooling, is they're probably going to be burnt out from being at the computer and their brains are going to be tired. And so when it comes time to do workouts, it's probably going to be harder for them to focus as well. Like I mentioned earlier too, we said the workout capacity, they're not going to have as much stamina because that heart pumping is not efficient and the oxygen uptake is not efficient either. And you also need to keep in mind that they're going to need more recovery time right now while they're getting back into sports. They're going to need more rest during practices. We won't be able to be as intense with the workouts and probably won't be able to do quite as many workouts during a week. They'll need a little bit more rest. So as I also mentioned previously, that we have increased injury risk with all of these changes that are going on. So like I said, we will have impaired performance and increased injury risk. So like I said, with the reaction time with our muscles and things, that there is an increased risk for ligament ruptures and muscle injuries. I had seen something the other day that actually, it wasn't quite an official study done yet, but just the incidence of the amount of ACL tears and significant ligament tears that are happening currently with the NFL even is kind of scary because they were also like elite athletes and have been out for a while. And with starting back to actual competition, we're seeing some pretty significant injuries happening even just early on. So if we cannot grant some important reconditioning, then we are going to have some possible significant injuries happen. Again, as mentioned on the previous couple slides, your cardiorespiratory and neuromuscular adaptations are fundamental in your different sports, and the declines that happen even just after a short term of about 4 weeks of no training is going to be seen. So we're going to have some significant differences after months of being out. And the biggest thing here that I wanted to bring to attention is just your cardiorespiratory failure, exertional heat illness, and exertional rhabdomyolysis are things that we need to watch out for. Although we maybe are avoiding some of the hot temperatures and things right now, any of our athletes that potentially have sickle cell or things like that, sometimes these heat illnesses and ER can happen even just with intense workouts. If they're trying to push too hard when they come back and they're not ready, their bodies aren't ready for it, they can still have these things happen even without the extrinsic factors. It's somewhat more of an intrinsic factor. The incidence of non-contact related injuries has increased significantly in the past decade, especially in student athletes who have returned to training after a period of inactivity and their level of conditioning has decreased. According to the National Center for Catastrophic Sport Injury Research, the risk of this non-contact injury is significantly greater after periods of inactivity if their workloads and recovery strategies are not adjusted to reflect athletes' reduced level of fitness. They also have some data indicating that almost 60% of non-contact injuries occur during these periods when the athlete is transitioning back into the training. And so this is suggesting that athletes are being exposed to workouts that are too excessive when they are immediately coming back, and or their training workload is being increased faster than their body can handle and adjust to. So how are we going, well, and then another statistic for you guys, the risk for the serious injury and death after a period of inactivity is also well documented and was addressed in the 2012 Inter-Association Task Force's best practice recommendations, where they said conditioning periods should be phased in gradually and progressively to encourage proper exercise acclimatization and to minimize the risk of adverse effects on health. So this kind of transitions us here from just talking about the fact that we do have injury risk to how do we need to approach coming back. So I pretty much copied and pasted here. We have this NATA consensus on returning after inactivity, and they had this amazing paragraph here that said strategies to combat detraining in your athletes. So these are just some steps that we can go over to remember as you're planning your workouts and things. So first step, coaches should either consult with the athletic trainers and or their certified strength and conditioning coach if you have one, when you're trying to come up with a plan as you come back to physical activity. You can just have them take a look at it and be like, hey, do you think this is going to be too much? Honestly, your best way to know that is just to, once you get your athletes together, you know, maybe just do some testing in the first couple of days just to see where everybody's at. You can kind of down here, skipping ahead down to number 6, you can use technology such as some heart rate monitors, things like that. Maybe some of the kids might have Fitbits or Apple Watches or something like that where they can even check their heart rate and things. So sometimes you don't even necessarily need to purchase that. They may already have something. You can also just use some good old pen and paper and or just ask them verbally, you know, here's the scale of exertion. How are you feeling? Do you feel like you're pushing yourself really hard? Do you feel like you could go harder? Things like that. But keep in mind that your athletic trainers, your sports medicine staff, if they see that these kids are really struggling, they're getting a whole bunch of athletes that are coming in, you know, with some of these signs and symptoms of maybe ER or the exertional heat illness or just cardiorespiratory distress, then please listen to them, listen to us as we say like, hey, these kids really aren't ready to be working out this hard. You need to back off. Because obviously our ultimate goal for all of us should just to keep these kids safe. The second point is set goals. Goals are great. Your physiological adaptations are going to take time, so you also need to be patient. Kind of highlighted this other piece underneath that, in which the first 7 days of any new conditioning cycle is your highest risk period. So this is where you definitely need to make sure you're modifying your workouts. There's no way these kids are going to be able to come back in the same point as when we left off in March. You also need to be positive. Like, these kids are going to be frustrated too that they can't do probably what they were doing before. But you can also remind them like, hey, this isn't, you know, permanent. You will get back in shape. We will get there. It's okay. Number 4, coming up with a structured weekly plan for their full return. They recommend a low volume impact, high intensity training 1 to 2 times a week. So nothing much, but you are going to have to challenge them a little bit. So 1 to 2 times a week initially is plenty. Making sure you're doing some cross training in the initial periods just to make sure you're getting that whole body system going. And incorporating different stressors so that it doesn't overwork the body all at once. Gradually, again, increasing the duration, intensity, and sports specificity of the exercise activities, and especially remembering to incorporate rest days. So typically, you know, here in high school, we don't do weekends, so that's a couple rest days right there, but as we get back into it, you may definitely want to consider, you know, one day of the week, a rest day, or making sure you have appropriate work to rest ratio during the workout times, which we will also address a little later on in this presentation. Encourage the athletes to consume high protein and nutrient dense food. I always kind of use the analogy, you know, your body is the car, you need to put some fuel in it. Are you going to fuel it, you know, with something that's inappropriate, or are you going to try to fuel it with something that's good? You're going to run better. Your car's going to run better with the better fuel. And then we already addressed number 6. So we'll keep on going. So the Joint Committee recommends that the prescription of the conditioning drills that we use after the period of inactivity follows this schedule of the 50-30-20-10 rule. So for these, we can almost call them new athletes. We'll probably have some new athletes coming out, or mostly in this case, we have athletes that are returning from a period of inactivity of greater than 2 weeks. We need to keep in mind that the first day of training or testing should be performed at about 50% of where you want to be at. That's where the 50 comes in here. Then you're looking at 30% the second week, and then gradually, you know, lessening that and getting back to your typical workloads. You should also be having a work to rest ratio of 1:4 or greater. So working for as much as you're working in a unit, you should have 4 times that amount of rest times worked in there. These rules are going to help provide a recommended percentage weekly reduction for your first 2 to 4 weeks of training based on, like I said, where you want to be overall. So that's where your goals come into play. This is where you want them to be fitness level wise. You're going to test them at about 50% of that, see what they can do. And then if you further need to reduce that as they go, then you can. And then you're just going to gradually increase the workload and volume. This is just a little scale chart, graph, whatever you want to call it, that I had found in the Joint Commission's paper, where it shows your status of what your athlete is. This particular paper was more focused on college athletes, and especially those who experienced a exertional heat illness or exertional rhabdomyolysis, because a lot of this wasn't addressed on how to return them safely. And so it was a great article, I thought, and could also be used in this instance for these athletes, even of high school level, as they're coming back to activity after not doing anything in a really long time. So it's showing your conditioning activities, how you're reducing them, where you can test them, your weight training, which we're going to get into, which is addressed with the FIT rule, and then even just some plyometrics. So like I said, the FIT rule is based on frequency, intensity, volume, and time of rest interval. That's where your acronym comes from. And this outlines the recommendations for your resistance training during these periods. So the 50-30-20-10 is kind of just looking at more like your volume and how intense you're going. And then this is more your actual resistance training that you're doing here. So this FIT rule is designed to ensure that your fitness or your frequency, your intensity relative volume or your IRV, and your time of rest interval are appropriately administered to minimize the chance of severe muscle damage. So your frequency is defined as the number of training sessions you're doing per week, especially for a specific muscle group or movement type. So if you're doing a leg day, you typically, I mean, this was kind of something that we've done even before this, but making sure you're not doing, you know, a back-to-back leg day, you know, make sure you kind of switch things up, like maybe legs, arms, back, things like that. It's recommended that your frequency does not exceed 3 days in the first week following a period of inactivity and no more than 4 days in the second week. So we're still trying to gradually increase that. Your intensity relative volume is a derivation of volume load that includes the percent of 1 rep max, and you use this equation to calculate that. So you're going to have in your sets, your reps, your percent of their 1 rep max, and then this is going to give you your IRV units. So there was a systematic review by McMaster et al., which indicated that IRVs between 11 and 20 are going to provide your greatest strength increases, whereas any IRVs between 20 and 30 actually produce strength increases that are lower, and anything below 11 may not be adequate to improve strength. So the Joint Committee recommends that your IRV or your equals portion there, some math class for you, between 11 and 30 is going to be the best for your muscle groups and movement types. Anything over 30 is not recommended at all. That's definitely going to be your muscle damage group right there. So try to stick to between 11 and 20, 30 max, but 11 to 20 is the highest recommended. The time of rest interval is also known as the work to rest ratio, like I mentioned before. So you have your work and then your rest. And this is also a vital component that must be considered. So these kids, as they're coming back, they're going to push, but they also need to have some rest breaks, catch their breath, let their heart rate, stabilize again, get some more oxygen so they can keep working out and getting back into shape. This is a table for the FIT rule, just breaking it down into the parameters. Nothing greater than 3 sessions for the first week, nothing greater than 4 after that. You want your IRV of 11 to 30, but they said, again, just to reiterate, that 11 to 20 is going to be where your greatest strength gains are. 20 to 30 is sometimes lower, but definitely nothing over 30, and anything under 11, you're going to be probably not seeing much for strength gains. There's your time to rest intervals broken down also. So they say 1 to 4 or any greater amount of rest is great. And then 1 to 3 work to rest. And then you see there, they've got the little asterisk where they're mentioning that your ratio after 2 weeks, your minimum should be 1 to 2. So you're still making sure that you're allowing periods of rest. And this rest provided during these traditional strength trainings will probably be greater, but this minimum standard is just making sure that you're providing protection for these student athletes, which are engaging in high volume, high intensity training sessions. So just to conclude, your strength and conditioning sessions should be appropriately designed and implemented to reflect the individual athlete's current level of fitness and fatigue, so we're not inducing excessive exertion. Obviously, we want them to exert themselves somewhat, kind of like the saying, no pain, no gain, but we don't want them to be in so much pain that they're actually having injuries and can't participate, and then we're reducing their fitness status yet again. And athletes' current levels of fitness and fatigue are dynamic in nature just because of the effects of maybe the training and that we're putting them through, the strength and conditioning, what they're putting into their body, food-wise, are they hydrating appropriately? Sleep has a huge impact on how your body can recover. And I know a lot of times these high school students are not getting even close to the amount of sleep that they need to get. And then just some other factors that need to be considered are medications and supplements that can impact their abilities as well. So this is why baseline testing is great, to just kind of get a feel for where each athlete is at. And then sometimes you can even break them into their groups based off of these things. So don't forget your testing importance as well. We went over the 50, 30, 20, 10 rule and the FIT rule to ensure that you're evaluating your program, making sure that student athletes are returning safely, but also effectively. And these guidelines are meant to protect student athletes in all sports. And these rules used during the first 2 to 4 weeks of your mandatory training after this period of inactivity gives each coach a roadmap, essentially, just like we as athletic trainers have with our concussion protocol. Like, when do we know that it's okay to progress this athlete? When do we need to hold back? And so on. These here are just my references where I got everything if you're interested in looking at them further or reading more about them. And that is it. Make sure you guys go to the website to complete our survey so we can make sure we're addressing these presentations well. And if you have anything else you would like to hear about, you can let us know. Thank you very much.